Well, kia ora everyone, it's good to be with you. The word bankrupt, it's probably the most depressing word in the English language. But it gets even more depressing when you punch it into a thesaurus and get a whole bunch of other synonyms that go with it. Insolvent, broke, ruined, lacking, wanting, on the rocks, in the red, needy, beggared, and so on. It's quite a sad list, isn't it, to describe people. And when we think about bankruptcy, we generally think, don't we, about financial bankruptcy. So a person or a business that's kind of come to the end of their money, they're now insolvent. When you look at the balance sheet, the assets are like this and the liabilities are like this, and there's just no way they can pay the debts. This thing is going under, it's bankrupt. But the word bankrupt can be used in other ways as well, not just financial bankruptcy, but we can sometimes talk about someone being ethically bankrupt. And an ethically bankrupt person is someone who is just really severely lacking in morals. They're someone who just really has no sense of what is right and wrong, and the way they behave leaves a great deal to be desired, the way they treat people and so on. It's also possible to talk about being creatively bankrupt. And so that's a situation where you're just completely out of fresh ideas. There's nothing there. I don't know if you've ever experienced in a work setting or an organizational setting a brainstorm session where people are just firing ideas out and people are buzzing and bouncing off each other, and you just sit there kind of like you've got nothing. You know, you sit there for half an hour and not one word has come out of your mouth. You just there's zero fresh ideas coming out. That's often called creative bankruptcy. And then sometimes people will use the word to describe their emotional state. I'm feeling emotionally bankrupt right now. And emotional bankruptcy is kind of like a psychological exhaustion, where someone is just so tired, just so drained that there's a sense in which they can't even sense what they're feeling, let alone describe those feelings. So to be bankrupt, to be destitute, to be needy can be financial, it can be emotional, it can be creative, it can be ethical. Perhaps the most damaging kind, the saddest kind of bankruptcy, however, is spiritual bankruptcy. Spiritual bankruptcy, that means to be desperately lacking before a holy God. It's to be in debt to God because of all the things, the sins and the brokenness of our lives. It's to owe so much more to God than we can ever pay. This is the way that the Apostle Paul sums up our spiritual bankruptcy in the book of Romans chapter 3. He wrote, "There is no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There's no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one." And that's a slamming indictment, isn't it? But what Paul is trying to argue with that, he's not saying that no one around the world ever does anything that is good, no good works or kindness or anything. But he's saying even when we do good, it's can be tainted and muddied by mixed motives that we have. And none of us in and of ourselves pursue God. There's a self-centeredness in the human heart. We are spiritually bankrupt. So as Jason said, we're in this series called Influences, where we're looking at the biggest block of teaching that we get from Jesus in the Gospels. In Matthew's Gospel, it's called the Sermon on the Mount. And in this series, we are zeroing in not on the whole Sermon on the Mount, but we're focusing particularly on the introduction, a series of blessing statements that we call the Beatitudes. And this is the way that Jesus sets up the Sermon on the Mount, describing the kind of person or the kind of people that are part of his kingdom. Those who are blessed or approved by God, the truly or the completely fortunate. So last week, Steve Young was here and he jumped into and drilled into the third of the Beatitudes about what it means to be meek and gentle. And today we're going to back the truck up a little bit back to the first two Beatitudes. And I want us to look at where Jesus begins as he starts this Sermon on the Mount. He begins with these words, and this is the paraphrase that I've come up with that we passed out a couple of weeks ago. But what Jesus begins with is this: how utterly fortunate are the bankrupt. Now I just want you to pause for a minute and look at those words on the screen. How utterly fortunate are the bankrupt? Because that sounds absurd, doesn't it? Normally speaking, those kinds of words just sound bizarre. What on earth would Jesus even mean? I mean, who wants to be bankrupt in their life in any kind of way? It's not like any of us sit down looking at developing our New Year's resolutions for the next year ahead, going, I'm hoping for bankruptcy this year. That's one of my goals. You know, none of us have teenagers finishing up high school, and I don't know if they still do yearbooks, but we did yearbooks when I was in high school, and there'd be a page at the end of all the year 13s who are graduating, most likely to be Prime Minister, and, most likely to be bankrupt. I mean, who's got that as a goal? No one starts a business, no one launches an organisation or a charity or anything with the hope that I'm really praying we'll be insolvent within 2 or 3 years. Bankruptcy is something that we consider horrific and something that we want to avoid. And here's Jesus at the very beginning of the most important sermon he preaches going, you are incredibly fortunate if you are bankrupt. And that should force us to stop and go, wait a minute, what is Jesus doing here? What is he saying? What we need to understand is that Jesus, all the way through the Sermon on the Mount, by the way, he isn't just plucking ideas out of the air. He's actually going back and building his comments on what the Old Testament has already taught. And as we come to these first 2 Beatitudes, we need to understand he's building it on some words that the prophet Isaiah spoke 700 years before him. Here's what it says in Isaiah 66 verse 2. This is God speaking. These are the ones I look on with favour, those who are humble and contrite in spirit and who tremble at my word. Those who are humble and contrite in spirit. And that's what Jesus is coming back to as he begins his sermon this way. Blessed are the poor in spirit, and blessed are those who mourn. Why? Because he's saying that God's favour and approval rests on people who recognise how bankrupt they are before God. They recognise how much they need his grace. The key idea today, friends, is this. Only the desperately needy find the grace they desperately need. Only the desperately needy find the grace they desperately need. And there is both bad news and good news in this key idea this morning. So let's start with the bad news, because that way we end up in the good news, which is a nice way to finish. But the bad news is, friends, that we are desperately needy. That's the message that the Bible shares with us from beginning to end. And that's what this first beatitude is all about, that Jesus begins with. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, or blessed are those who recognize their spiritual bankruptcy. You see, the opposite of that is to feel self-sufficient, is to be self-righteous, is to presume you don't need God, and that actually you're good enough in and of yourself. This is often what I get told by non-Christians if I can get into a spiritual discussion with them, and they may say something like, look, I don't know if there's a God or not, but if there's a God and if I stand before him at the end of time, I'll be good. It's the sense of, no, I don't need God, I'm sweet, I'm fine. And in fact, Jesus told a fascinating parable in one of the other Gospels, the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament, that contrasts these two mindsets really, really well. He says in Luke 18, he tells this story, this parable about 2 men who go up to the temple to pray. One of those men was a Pharisee. Now, the Pharisees were the super duper religious people of Jesus' day. They were like the professional good guys. They read the scriptures and studied the scriptures. They went out of their way to obey scripturally everything they could in what God has said. They avoided any kinds of evil. They gave to charity. They were the people that everyone else looked up to, like, whoa. And in Jesus' parable, the Pharisee comes to the temple and he stands with hands raised, which was the way they prayed. And he said, God, thank you that I'm such a good guy. Thank you that I give money to charity. Thank you that I study your word. Thank you that I obey your word. Thank you that I'm not like the rest of the schmucks around me here. And Jesus said there was another guy who prayed. Way over here, there was a tax collector in Jesus' story. Now, the tax collectors were the scumbags of Jesus' world. The Israelites had been conquered by the Romans. They were part of the Roman Empire. And so the tax collectors were traitors who were collecting taxes for the hated Romans. But not only were they traitors, they were also scoundrels and thieves, because the way the system worked is a tax collector would make a bid to be the tax collector for a region or a town, and they'd offer so much to the Romans, and they'd have to pay the Romans, and then they had to recoup that by putting taxes and duties and everything onto people. But of course, the temptation was always to extort people and to charge more and to come up with ways to steal more and more money from people to make a profit. And so the tax collectors were absolutely hated both as traitors and as thieves. And in the story Jesus tells, here's the Pharisee, hands raised in the air, praying to God what a great guy he is. And here's the tax collector, no hands raised, his head is even bowed. Jesus said he wouldn't even look up into heaven, and he prayed a simple prayer. He said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. And then Jesus makes this fascinating comment at the end of his parable in Luke chapter 18. He says, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, rather than the other one, the Pharisee, this man went home justified before God. This man went home right with God. Now, as Jesus told that parable, there was probably an audible gasp in the crowd. Because the Pharisees they're the good guys. The Pharisees are the paragon of virtue. If anyone's right with God, these guys are at the front of the queue. And Jesus comes along and throws that completely upside down. And then he makes this statement at the end of the parable. He says, for all of those who exalt themselves, they'll be humbled. But those who humble themselves, they will find themselves exalted. And what Jesus was saying in that parable is exactly what he's saying as he begins the Sermon on the Mount. That it's only those who are desperately needy that find the grace they desperately need. But what we need to understand is it's possible to recognize our need. It's possible to declare bankruptcy, but not to declare complete bankruptcy. See, there's some ways in the financial world that you can kind of declare yourself insolvent as a business to try and buy yourself some time. It can get a little murky in New Zealand, but in the States, they have really clear legislation on this. And they have two different types of bankruptcy. They call it Chapter 11 and Chapter 7, based on the legislation it comes from. Don't worry about the numbers. What they mean by that is that, though, if a business is in trouble financially, they can declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy or temporary bankruptcy. And what that means is the business can kind of become bankrupt for a season of time, which means the creditors that are circling like sharks just have to take a step back. And it gives that business time to reconfigure, to work out its debt, to maybe sell off a couple of lines that aren't working and trade their way back into profitability again. So it's a temporary situation to buy them the time to work their way back into profit. Whereas Chapter 7 bankruptcy is the other form that a company can take, and it's all over Rover. That's where they just declare bankruptcy, the business is stuffed, the assets are tiny compared to the mountain of debt, and the company is going to shut down. And the creditors might be lucky to get 5 or 10 cents for every dollar they're owed. So it's temporary and permanent. And friends, I think that oftentimes we understand we shouldn't be a self-righteous person who stands before God saying, I don't need anything, I'm good. We understand the need to acknowledge our need, but I wonder if sometimes, rather than declaring permanent bankruptcy, that there's nothing that we can bring to God, I wonder if sometimes we declare something more like a temporary bankruptcy. God, I know I'm broken, I know I've got some sin, but if you could just clear the debt, if you could just help me out, then I will then now work hard to earn my favor with you from this point on. If you can just give me a little bit of grace that I need, then I'll work my way out of this. I think the best example of this kind of idea in the Bible comes from another parable that Jesus told in Luke chapter 15. Many of you will know it very well. It's called the story of the prodigal son. It's about the younger of two boys who comes to his father one day, Jesus says, and says, I want my share of the inheritance now, which is a pretty sad way of saying, Dad, I wish you were dead because the money's more important to me than you are. And surprisingly, in the story, as Jesus tells it, the father goes, okay, and he liquidates some assets and he gives his youngest son his share of the estate early. And the son gets all the money together and he heads off on his OE and goes to a faraway country, and where over time he loses everything. And he ends up homeless and penniless and destitute. There's a famine in that land. Jesus says the only job the young boy can get is working for a pig farmer. Now that's a sad place to be if you're a Jewish boy, because pigs are not kosher. And so you don't want to be serving pigs, and he's serving pigs, and he's even eating the slops that the pigs are eating. That's how bad life has got for this prodigal. And one day he comes to his senses, Jesus says. And the way that many of us read that story is we go, oh, so he repents and he comes home. But I think we're a little hasty. I would suggest that what the prodigal son does is he doesn't declare permanent bankruptcy and just says, Dad, I'm sorry, I've stuffed it. Instead, what he actually says is, I'm going to go home and I'm going to say to my father, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I don't deserve to be your son. Make me one of your hired servants. So here's the plan that the prodigal has got. I'm going to go home. I'm going to see if my dad will hire me as a servant. I'll live in the servants' quarters. I'll collect the wage that the servants get, and I'll save that up until the day comes where I'll have saved enough to pay off the debt that I owe my dad, and I'll work my way back into his affection and his love. See, the prodigal is declaring temporary bankruptcy. I just need a little bit of grace, Dad, until I get back on my feet and work hard and save the money, and then I'll work my way back into your affection and your love. And then in the story, the father doesn't let him do that. The father just rushes in and surrounds him with grace and love, because that is exactly what God is like. But I wonder how many of us declare temporary bankruptcy. Our understanding of grace is that we just need a little bit, just enough to get us through the mess we've found ourselves in. If God could just clear our debt of sin for us, and then we'll make it right from here on in. And friends, that isn't how grace works. The grace of God isn't available just to fix up the gap between where we can get to ourselves and what we need before a holy God. We need grace from start to finish. See, so often we compare ourselves to other people and think, well, look at all these other people in this church. I'm way better than the rest of these jokers. You know, imagine if the problem with that is, imagine if the debt we owe to God was as vast as the Pacific Ocean. So you've got to swim the Pacific in order to get to a holy God. And friends, it doesn't matter if you're an amazing swimmer and you're such a good person. You can swim 5Ks, and I'm pretty pathetic, so I can only swim 100 meters. It actually doesn't matter, because we're both going to drown because we can't make it. We don't need a little bit of God's grace to make up for it, because as we just declare our temporary bankruptcy, what Jesus wants us to understand as he launches the Sermon on the Mount is, friends, we are in deep trouble. We are bankrupt before God, and there's nothing we can do to get out of it in and of ourselves. We could work for all of eternity, and our good works would never make up for the sin and the brokenness and the evil of our lives. And so Jesus comes as he begins this most famous sermon that he preaches. And he says, blessed, approved, how utterly fortunate are those who are poor in spirit, who declare their spiritual bankruptcy and their deep need of God. That's what this first beatitude is doing. It's helping us realize the spiritual reality where we see our poverty before God. And then the second beatitude is built on that. Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn. Approved by God are those who mourn. And he's not talking here about just grieving anything in life that's sad or that we've lost. He's not talking here about grieving someone that we've lost in life who's passed away, or an opportunity that's been missed, or grieving a broken romance. All of those things are very real, and the Bible assures us that God is near to the brokenhearted. But in the context of the Sermon on the Mount, because this beatitude follows the first one, most scholars believe that what Jesus is specifically talking about here is mourning our sin. It's grieving over our brokenness. It's acknowledging our bankruptcy in the first beatitude, and then grieving that and feeling the emotional weight of our brokenness and our sin before God. It's crying out to him. Perhaps the most compelling example of this in the Bible, or one of them at least, is King David, one of the greatest kings in the Old Testament that Israel ever had. The writer of copious psalms in the Bible. He did a beautiful job of living his life for God through most of the chapters. But there comes a moment later in his life where King David utterly and spectacularly blows it. Many of you will know the story. He looks out one day, sees a beautiful woman bathing. He's a peeping Tom. He lusts after her. He summons her to the palace, ends up committing adultery at best, potentially rape at worst. She ends up getting pregnant, lets him know. He calls for her husband, who's one of the key soldiers in the army, who comes home. David gets him drunk to try and get him to go home and sleep with his wife, so it looks like the baby's his, but he's too much of a person of character to do that. So David sends him back to the battlefield with a note, which means he ends up getting killed. So David is now a murderer, and he covers the whole thing up, marries the woman, thinks it's hunky-dory for a year, and then God goes, I've had enough of this. And he sends a prophet named Nathan to confront King David. And it's almost as like David has had these scales on his over his eyes. He hasn't seen all of the mess and the brokenness he's done until the moment Nathan looks at him and says, you are the man. And it's like the scales fall off, and David just goes, what have I done? And he is confronted with the enormity of his sin. And he repents. He is a broken man who grieves over his sin. And in that moment, he writes one of the most incredible psalms in our Bible, Psalm 51. Here's what it says. He writes, have mercy on me, O God, according to your unfailing love. According to your great compassion, blot out my transgressions, wash away all my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. He's pleading for the forgiveness and the cleansing of God, asking him to wash away his sin. But notice, David doesn't cry out for that forgiveness on the basis that he deserves it. Well, God, I've been an amazing dude, and so you should forgive me. No, instead he comes to God and he just throws himself. God, would you forgive me on the basis of your amazing love for me? I don't deserve this, but I'm asking you to forgive me because that's the kind of God you are. And then he prays this at the end of his psalm. You don't delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You don't take pleasure in burnt offerings, which was the normal way they would deal with their sin. Instead, he says, my sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, and a broken and contrite heart you, God, will not despise. See, David's a living example of what Jesus was saying as he began his Sermon on the Mount. He said how utterly fortunate it is when you come to the realization that you are utterly bankrupt and desperately needy, and you grieve over that sin. Because it's only the desperately needy who find the grace they desperately need. And that's true, isn't it? It's often in life that we need to desperately, deeply feel our need in order to get it sorted out. I mean, how many of us have had a dull toothache for month after month after month and don't do anything about it until we wake up in the middle of one night with the screaming, throbbing pain, and we go, okay, now I'll make an appointment with the dentist. Yeah? Or how many of us have an issue with the car? There's some weird sound in the car, and we just pretend to ignore it, thinking that's going to help it go away. And we'll drive the car for week after week after week, until finally we're driving one day and something is squealing so loud you can hear it on the other side of Auckland. And we think, okay, maybe now I should probably call the mechanic. Or we know we're putting on a little bit of weight and we should probably go to the gym and start working out and make sure we deal with this. But we kind of leave it. And then one day we step onto the scales and they scream at us. And we go, okay, now I'll sign up for the gym. See, the truth is, friends, it's often only when we see how desperately needy we are in an area of life that we then take action. And what Jesus is wanting us to see as he begins these Beatitudes is it's only when we see our desperate spiritual need, that's when we go running to a God of grace and we find the grace we desperately need. See, and that's the good news of this message, friends. The bad news is that you and I are desperately needy, that we are utterly bankrupt, and we need to acknowledge that and come running to God. But the good news is that when we do that, when we acknowledge our bankruptcy, when we put our hand up and confess how needy we are, this wonderful Savior who lived the perfect life we couldn't live and died for our sins to pay the penalty of that, and then rise again from the dead to conquer sin and death. When we come running to him and confess our bankruptcy, he envelops us with his love and his grace and his mercy. He forgives us. He adopts us into the family. He promises life forever, and we are now his no matter what. And all of it is undeserved. That is the brilliant news of this story. And that's what Jesus is promising, by the way, in these opening two Beatitudes. Notice what he says, verses 3 and 4 of Matthew 5, as he begins this sermon. Blessed, he says, are the poor in spirit, those who declare spiritual bankruptcy, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And notice here I've highlighted the word theirs. The way this is written, that is put into the front of the sentence for emphasis. It's like what Jesus is saying is this: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs and theirs alone is the kingdom of heaven. In other words, when you declare spiritual bankruptcy, when you join the tax collector and say, have mercy on me, O God, a sinner, what Jesus is saying is, now you get into my kingdom, because that's the only way in. And he goes on, blessed are those who mourn over their sin, for they and they alone will be comforted. It's the promise in the new heavens and the new earth to wipe away every tear. And so what Jesus is saying is the utterly fortunate are the people who stand with a tax collector and who say, have mercy on me, O God, I'm a sinner. Because they get into the kingdom now. And they will be part of that kingdom in all of its fullness forever and ever and ever. Amen. See, this is what the prophets had promised so long ago. Isaiah 57 says, this is what the high and exalted one says, the one who lives forever, whose name is holy. He says, I live in a high and holy place. Which means if you want to live with God forever, you need to be holy and perfect like him. Or, here's the second option, but I also live with the one who is contrite and lowly in spirit, to revive the spirit of the lowly and revive the heart of the contrite. You see, the grace and mercy of Jesus is not available to anyone who stands there and says, no, I'm good enough. I don't have a problem, thanks. And neither is that grace and mercy available to any prodigal who goes, look, I just need a bit of a helping hand. If you just help me through this mess, temporary bankruptcy, I'll work this out from here. The grace and mercy of Jesus is only offered to those who are willing to acknowledge their desperate need, their complete bankruptcy, and come running to the God who wants to lavish us with love and grace and forgiveness and hope and to be adopted into the family. So as we finish today, I want to ask you a simple question. Where do you stand today? Are you standing with the Pharisee? Maybe not boasting like he was about how amazing he is, but having that self-confidence in your own goodness and your own righteousness, and you're going to be okay. So many people live in our world. If there's a God, and if I've got to give an account to him one day, she'll be right. And the message of the Bible is actually it won't be right. And if we're standing here, we need to move. Or maybe you're standing with the prodigal son, declaring temporary bankruptcy. I've made a mess, I acknowledge that. God, if you just give me a little bit of grace, cancel the debt, help me get back on my feet, then I'll take it from there and I'll work hard and I'll make it right and I'll do everything I need to do. When the truth of the matter is we continue to mess up our lives all the time. And the invitation of the opening Beatitudes of the Sermon on the Mount is to choose to stand with a tax collector with our heads bowed and to acknowledge before God, we're broken. We're bankrupt. And to cry out for his mercy and love that he is just waiting to pour out on us as we come to him. It is only the desperately needy who find the grace they desperately need. So as we finish, I want to come back to a question that was on the screen at the very beginning of this message. It was a question that asked this: how can recognizing our bankruptcy change the world? How can standing there and declaring our bankruptcy, how does that change the world? Because that's what Jesus promises in the next part of the sermon, that you are the salt of the earth. If this is you, if you've declared bankruptcy, you're now the light of the world. So how does that work? How can we change the world by being bankrupt people? And I want to suggest as we finish 3 really simple ways. You see, bankrupt people who mourn over their sin will be humble people. Bankrupt people are humble people. Because if you've declared bankruptcy, no one throws you a parade, do they? If you declare bankruptcy, you don't jump on social media and post that everywhere to celebrate. You don't boast about the failure. Instead, if you're going to do anything, you point to the one who has saved you from that. You point to the one who saved. That's why the Bible again and again and again will call us to boast in Jesus alone and in the grace of God. And actually, bankrupt people who mourn their sin the way Jesus is describing should be the most humble people in the world. Bankrupt people who mourn their sin should almost be the most gracious people in the world. Bankrupt people are gracious people. Because when we understand the depth of our own bankruptcy and our own neediness and how much we need God's grace, then when others fail and others hurt us, we should find it easy to accept that and to extend grace. When we've been forgiven so much, we should find it simple to forgive others who hurt us. We should be the most gracious people in the world. And to the extent that we struggle to do that, the extent that we struggle to forgive people who hurt us, may be suggesting that maybe we haven't declared total bankruptcy like we thought. Because bankrupt people who mourn over their sin are humble people and they're gracious people. And thirdly, they're thankful people. And again, friends, we should be the most thankful in the world. When we see the desperate state we were in and recognize this God who loves us and adopts us and forgives us so freely, we should be singing, "Yea, God," with every breath we've got. Because it's only the desperately needy who find the grace that we so desperately need. And if you've found that grace, if you've declared permanent bankruptcy, full bankruptcy, and have come running to Jesus, whether that's in the last few minutes or whether that's 50 years ago, my prayer is that you would be among the most humble and gracious and thankful people the world has ever seen. Because when you are salt and you are light, and the world desperately needs to see that. As we finish today, we are going to pause and we're going to come to the communion table. Those of us who are live here, if you're watching online, you're welcome to do this with us as well. But we're going to come and take these emblems that Jesus gave us of bread and juice that symbolize his body and his blood. Here's what I want you to understand. Only bankrupt people come and take communion. Because communion is a symbol of what he has done for us when we couldn't do anything for ourselves. So as you come to the table today, I want to invite you to come humbly. I want to invite you to come thankfully. I want you to come bowed low, recognizing how much you need him, but recognizing the wonder of his grace that has restored you. Because it's only the desperately needy folks who find the grace that we so desperately need. So Jesus, we come to you today so utterly thankful at these words that you preached so long ago that remind us of how needy we are. And thank you for this declaration that we are blessed and approved when we acknowledge our need and grieve over it. How utterly fortunate are you who declare spiritual bankruptcy? Why? Because you are the ones who have inherited God's kingdom. And how utterly fortunate are you who weep over your sin? Why? Because you are the ones who will one day have your tears dried by God himself.